Implementing Android Accessibility Patterns, presented by Anirudh Vicharia, AliCamp 2021. We'd like to thank our gold sponsors Telstra and Intopia, our silver sponsors ANZ and Coles, and our bronze sponsor How2.
G'day everyone, welcome to AliCamp 2021. My name is Anirudh Vicharia, but everyone calls me Ani, and today we're going to be talking about implementing Android accessibility patterns. Before jumping into things, I thought I'd introduce myself. I'm a mobile engineer at ANZX. I'm working currently on building the ANZ Plus internet banking app, and as part of that team, I'm working as part of tech enablement, where I look after componentry and accessibility. I've been writing Android apps since basically 2010, and professionally in the banking industry since 2015, where we have to maintain a high level of accessibility. Going over what we're covering today, we're going to have a look at some design and implementation principles, as well as actually how to implement some code patterns around these. Within the code patterns, we'll have a look at the view and the compose side of things, but there might be a little bit less emphasis on compose, just given how new some things are. Within that, we'll have a look at some quick little snippets, which are some useful functions and things that you can use for accessibility. We'll have a look at how to group announcements and group content together for screen readers and TalkBack. And as part of that, we'll also have a look at how to create reusable and accessible components. Just as a heads up though, this does assume a bit of knowledge of Android and Jetpack Compose and Kotlin, but I'll try and simplify and generalize things as much as possible. The source code and the slides for this, including some bonus content, is also available on GitHub, so I'll provide a link where relevant. So let's talk about some design and implementation principles. Today I'm going to talk about 5 principles that I use quite often to make sure that things are done in an accessible manner in apps. So the first principle I'm going to talk about is actually to keep accessibility in mind all throughout your product lifecycle. You want to start considering accessibility as soon as you start understanding requirements, and keep iterating and refining on those. You want to always test, and this means validating your product beforehand with user groups, testing it with as many devices and configurations as possible when you've actually implemented it, and testing it with as many different users as possible, and always keep maintaining your accessibility. We're basically all responsible for the accessibility of our apps, and it's your responsibility as engineers and part of a product team to raise any concerns you have up. The second principle is to actually keep content simple and consistent. You want to make sure that content displayed to users is clear and easy to understand. You want to make sure that any interactions are obvious and non-ambiguous, and you want to avoid overcrowding content. Generally, the more accessible your app is, the greater the user experience is for all of our users. The third principle I'm going to talk about is creating standardized components. So basically, your design language can be a big guideline for this one. You want to create a library of reusable code components where you have accessibility behaviors built in from the start. These behaviors could be things like building in sensible defaults wherever possible, making sure that whenever you're setting text content, you have a setter so you can provide alternative accessible content for that text, and also incorporating implicit accessibility behaviors into the code. This ensures that you can have very consistent visual and accessible components and improves reuse throughout your application. The next principle is to allow components to self-describe. So this especially is relevant when you're building custom components or building out components used throughout your screens. If you have one component that contains a lot of other components, you want to avoid forcing an accessibility description from that outer component. What you should do is allow the subcomponents to describe their own accessibility state instead of stitching things together manually. This leads to less error-prone code and logic throughout your application. The fifth and final principle is to basically customize purposefully and don't fight the accessibility framework. You want to use the native accessibility framework with just the right level of customization. So you want to avoid introducing behaviors that will break or behave inconsistently. This helps avoid bugs. You always want to make sure you keep backwards compatibility in mind. Making sure that you use Google Support Library helps with this, as well as testing. And finally, you want to embrace native expectations, so you want to avoid hacking in behaviors for the sake of consistency. An example of this might be switches. On some devices for certain manufacturers, a switch might announce as a toggle. However, if you try and force it to say switch because that's what your requirement says, you should really consider pushing back on those requirements. You want to avoid your apps standing out compared to all of the other apps on a user's device in a potentially wrong way, as this is another way of introducing inconsistency for the user's device. Android's accessibility services are basically constantly evolving and improving and actually getting more standardized. So you want to keep an eye and keep on top of accessibility system changes. And just as a bit of a call out, sometimes things are a bit of a fine balance. You have your requirements and you have the limitations of the accessibility system. And we all want to make sure that we build the best accessible experience as possible, but you do need to work within the constraints of your system. Have a tryout, make sure what you do works and works consistently. So let's dig into some code. The code is available in the AliCamp demo repository in my GitHub, and a link has been provided. The code has been simplified to illustrate key points and is done in Views as well as Compose, and there's some bonus goodies in there. Just so you know, Compose is fairly new, so things are subject to a bit of change and improvements as we go along. Let's have a look at our first quick snippet. So the first one we're going to have a look at is very commonly used. This is the content description. You can think of this as the accessibility label, and screen readers like TalkBack will announce this to accessible users. If nothing is set, whatever defaults will automatically be provided. In XML layouts, there is a very handy content description property where you can set text against it, or you can use a string resource. And using code, all you have to do is locate your view and set the content description property. Now let's look at the Compose alternative to this. So Compose uses a thing called modifiers and semantics. Modifiers are additional properties against any UI component, and semantics provide additional information on top of that about things like accessibility as well as other things. So when we want to set a content description for any composable, you basically set a modifier, you use the semantics modifier, and you can provide a content description using the handy property called content description. Our next quick snippet is setting accessibility headings. Most of the time you'll do this via Vue XML, but you can do it via code. This is only available from Android 9 and above, so it's a little bit of a compromise for older devices, but this is only supported by the OS from then onwards. All you have to do to make a component an accessibility heading is set the accessibility heading property to true in XML, and then you can suppress the warning using the tool's target API P property. If you want to do this via code, you just have to look up the view and use the view compat method, which basically deals with any compatibility issues for setting the heading. And as before with the Compose side of things, we're back to using semantics. There's a function called heading, which will basically mark up any composable as a heading. Let's have a look at one of our first code-based accessibility patterns. What we want to achieve as part of this one is actually grouping together content and announcements. When you have apps that display data, or even simple things like settings, you want to make sure that any announcement to accessible users has any contextually relevant information in one single announcement. Now obviously you don't want to bombard users with content that's excessively long, but there are other ways of managing that kind of content, such as doing an interactive element and then going deeper into a more detailed screen with more information for it. For grouping content, I've created some group content screens. There's some for Views as well as for Compose, so we can have a look at how each of those approaches are similar or contrast. As part of this screen, we have a couple bits of labels and different types of content on the screen. The first is just a collection of text views, which we just want to make a single announcement for. The next one is another kind of a card style view, which has when a contact is last seen. We want to group those together into a single announcement. And finally, we have a settings toggle, which has icons, a bit of text, and a toggle switch. We want to consolidate that into a single announcement and have interactions work as a single element. So, prior to making the changes, here's what the content looks like. What you'll notice is that as you swipe through using TalkBack, each of the elements is very distinctly announced instead of being grouped together like we expect.
This is label text. This is description text. John Smith. Last seen 5 minutes ago. Notifications. Receive push notifications. Notifications disabled. Switch.
So let's have a quick look at the layout that we're going to create a grouped announcement for. It's a contact last seen card. It has a material card view and a constraint layout to lay things out. And within it we have an image view which has an icon which is pinned to the left. Just to the right of that we have a text view which has the person's name and it's a label for that. And underneath that person name label we have another text view which says when they've last been seen. Especially for simple text content like this, we're going to avoid setting the content description against the whole material card view which contains everything. All we have to do is set a couple properties against that card view. So the first one we're going to set is important for accessibility and we're going to make that yes. And also we're going to make this keyboard accessible by making it focusable and setting that value to true. Now let's have a look at a slightly more complex layout. We have a push notifications setting toggle here, and we want clicks on the whole item to toggle it. It is laid out very similarly to our contact last seen card. However, all the way on to the right of it, we have a switch which allows us to do the toggling. So, just as before, to group up the announcement for the setting toggle, we're going to go to the material card view that contains everything. We're going to make it important for accessibility yes and focusable yes, and this will group up most of the text content for it. The twist with this one is that any interactive element will receive a separate focus from TalkBack, and in this case it's the switch down the bottom. We want to disable it from being clickable, and we want to make it not focusable so TalkBack doesn't access it. We're going to use clickable faults and focusable faults to do that. In the activities or whatever is consuming this, what we can do is set a click listener against the material card view itself, and then whenever we receive a click, we use that to toggle the switch. Now, let's have a look at how we can achieve the same kind of grouping in Compose. Switching things up a bit, we're having a look at our Compose code for this. Instead of using views, we use composables. We have a contact last seen card just like we had before, but instead of using Vue XML layouts, it's laid out using Kotlin code. We have a card, a constraint layout, an image for the person's icon, a text which has a label for the person's name, and another bit of text for when they were last seen. It is identical to the Vue layout, but just in Compose. To group up the announcement for accessibility services, we're going to do something very similar to what we did with views, but in Compose. We're going to go to the card itself, and we're going to add some modifiers to it, and these modifiers allow us to change some of the properties for accessibility. The ones we're going to look at specifically is semantics, and we're going to set merge descendants to true using that semantics modifier, and that does the actual grouping. And additionally, we're going to set focusable to it, and that helps it out so it's accessible via screen readers and TalkBack. So all we're going to do is add that into the card itself. We've got the semantics modifiers added in, which merges the descendants, and we're going to make it focusable. To group up the announcement for accessibility services, we're going to do something very similar to what we did with views, but in Compose. We're going to go to the card itself, and we're going to add some modifiers to it, and these modifiers allow us to change some of the properties for accessibility. The ones we're going to look at specifically is semantics, and we're going to set merge descendants to true using that semantics modifier, and that does the actual grouping. And additionally, we're going to set focusable to it, and that helps it out so it's accessible via screen readers and TalkBack. So all we're going to do is add that into the card itself. We've got the semantics modifiers added in, which merges the descendants, and we're going to make it focusable. In Compose, the settings toggle item is actually a little bit more complicated. What it comes down to is, instead of making the switch non-focusable for accessibility, we're going to make the card itself a toggleable element instead. And we're going to achieve this using a toggleable modifier, which basically takes all of the interactions and it uses those instead. Instead of the switch being toggled, we're actually toggling the card itself and then having that state reflected in the switch. I'd really recommend checking out the source code to actually see how this is done and have a little bit of a play around with it. And basically, after all of that code, what we'll notice is that whenever we interact with the screen using a screen reader or TalkBack, every single swipe or interaction with it groups up the data together into a single announcement for accessible users.
Label text. This is description text. John Smith. Last seen 5 minutes ago. Notifications. Receive push notifications. Notifications disabled. Switch.
So you might have noticed a little bit of a difference in the approach for the compose side of things. This is actually a little bit different to how it would have come out if it was built out using a view. So we'll just have a look at that announcement and we'll notice it's different, but it's currently probably a constraint of the system.
Notifications disabled. Notifications. Receive push notifications. Off. Switch. Double tap to toggle. Notifications enabled.
The next pattern we'll look at is creating reusable and accessible components. Instead of having a bit of code that is copied and pasted all throughout a codebase, we want to convert this into a single reusable component where we can make sure that things are consistent and accessible. The fun thing is, we can actually reuse the code from our previous example. We've done a bunch of the heavy lifting of grouping together the announcements already in that code, and now we'll just consolidate it into a single component. To demonstrate creating a consistent, reusable, accessible component in the view side of things, what we're going to do is we're going to take our contact last seen card and turn it into a reusable component. Previously we had a material card view, its constraint layout, the icon, the text for the name, and the text for the last seen label, all defined in XML. What we want to do is extract out that material card view into its own custom view group, while maintaining the focusable and important for accessibility properties. After that, we want to make sure that the constraint layout with everything inside of it is also injected into it and is configurable via XML and via code, giving us the most flexibility. After this process is done of extracting it out, that means we can reuse this all throughout our application, and the experience for accessible users is the same. After extracting all of our component into its own custom view group, we've basically ensured that it's a reusable component now. This means that the behavior for accessibility will always be consistent throughout our application. We've made sure that it is always important for accessibility and always focusable in the code, as well as make it configurable via XML and code. What I'd recommend doing is checking out this code and having a bit of a play around to see how this is exactly done, because it's a little bit complex to sort of go through everything. But suffice to say, this is how we sort of wrap up components in a custom reusable way. One thing to watch out for here is that whenever we set the last seen text, we're also updating the last seen content description, and this uses a special format to make sure that it is announced nicely for accessible users. This behavior is now built in and it's reusable. One of the nice things about Compose is that your UI is actually described by code. And because it is code, that means you can lift and shift it and move it around as you need. To make this into a proper reusable component, we're just going to go back to the card and all of the constraint layout and the images and the text labels for everything, and we're just going to pull that into its own composable function. That way, instead of it being in one spot and then copied and pasted a bunch of times, it is now in a reusable spot. And here's something that I prepared earlier. All I've done is taken that code that we had before. So the card, the constraint layout within it, the image within that, the text for the name, the text for the last seen label, and all I've done is I've pulled it into its own composable function. On top of that, instead of hard coding things like the person's name and the last seen text, I've created parameters for these so they can be configured wherever you need it. For accessibility, just in case it is required, for the last seen text, I've provided a content description field so we can set it if required. Now, as a good practice in Compose, we want to make sure that we pull out our components into composable functions so they can be reused as much as possible. But as part of that, we also need to make the modifiers configurable so that you can lay it out wherever you need it in the right little way. we also want to make sure that we don't lose out on some of those good accessibility behaviors that we've set up before, like merging the announcements together and making sure it's screen reader focusable. So, all we've done in this case is allowed the modifier to be passed through, but we've also made it implicit that the semantics for merging the descendants is set to true, so we get that merged announcement, and it's always focusable. On top of that, we're also generating a custom content description for the last seen text. We're going to use a little bit of code here which either uses the provided last seen content description or the last seen text, and it builds up a custom announcement for accessible users. This is now a nice reusable bit of code that we can replicate throughout our application and it will behave the same. So let's see what we've achieved. What we have here is our component and it's reused twice in this demo screen. What we notice is that the accessibility announcement for this is actually very consistent. Now, if we can do some more complicated stuff just like this for other types of components, we can actually scale this out all throughout our application.
John Smith, last seen 5 minutes ago. Bill Smith, last seen 15 minutes ago.
One of the last things I'll mention is also around custom rendered components. So, for very simple components where you have maybe one element, it might be okay to get away with setting the content description for the whole component. But if you have multiple elements within it and you want to provide better accessibility for it, I'd really recommend looking into the Explore by Touch helper and Virtual Views API. But this is a bit of an advanced topic. Other than that, other types of custom components can use the accessibility node and accessibility delegate APIs. A good way of figuring out how other components do this, like switches, is to actually look at the code and see how they build up their custom information for this. In Compose, there's also a bunch of additional semantic modifiers. I'd really recommend looking into the references for the slides, and especially around roles. So just recapping and wrapping things up, always keep accessibility in mind. Accessibility won't be a once-off thing, and there will be framework improvements and changes as things go along. Hopefully using the principles from this presentation and some of the code snippets, this will make accessibility simpler to design, implement, and maintain. I'd recommend checking out the GitHub code and having a bit of a play around, and I hope you got something out of this. Thanks everyone.
AliCamp 2021